I'm Lauren from Migraine Australia, and this afternoon I'm interviewing Professor Lyn Griffiths about her migraine research. Thank you for sharing your time. Could you please tell me about your research?
Hi, I'm a molecular geneticist, so I'm interested in trying to track down genes for disorders, and my main area of interest has been for many years the genes involved in migraine. So I'm really trying to identify those genes, and if you can then identify genes that play a role in the disorder, it not only gives you a clue for developing new treatments, but it can also aid in diagnosis as well.
And where are you up to in your research?
So quite a number of genes for migraine have been identified. So we've been working on this a long time, decades now actually. We've been working with cases, people who are affected with migraine, controls, people who are not affected, and also large families who suffer from migraine. Those studies have been, and we've collaborated with people around the world in relation to this research as well. But those studies have identified a number of genes that cause migraine, particularly severe subtypes of migraine, and some genes that play a role in susceptibility to migraine. So I might separate the two things there. So the causal genes are ones that if you have the mutation in the gene, then you definitely have migraine. And what's more is you pass this on to your offspring as well. So there are, in fact, several known causative genes for particular subtype of migraine, migraine with aura. And it's a subtype of that one called familial hemiplegic migraine. So this type of migraine has obviously the head pain, the nausea, vomiting, all of those things you get with migraine. But at the same time, it also has some paralysis, usually on one half of the body or parts of one half of the body, problems with speaking as well. Sometimes that paralysis can extend for quite a while. Sometimes it can even be associated with more severe things like even coma sometimes too. This is actually migraine. It's a type of migraine. It's a type of migraine that's inherited in a dominant fashion through families. And there are three known genes that cause it at this stage. So one's a gene that controls calcium levels in the brain. Another one controls ATP, which is something that releases energy in the brain. And the third one is a sodium channel gene, so it controls sodium levels. So all of these are what's called ion channel genes. And just to make this clear, they're not very common types of migraine, but they are very severe. So they can quite often affect quite young children. As I mentioned, they run dominantly through families. And they have some really horrible symptoms that tend to overlap with things like stroke or even with tumours. So sometimes it's hard to diagnose. And so it's important to know, is it one of these three genes? If so, which one is it? Because there's actually different treatments depending on which gene it is as well. So we currently do run a diagnostic service for all of Australia and New Zealand so that any neurologists who see patients like this and who are wondering, have I got a patient with this disorder or this particular one, can send samples to us. So they come from all around Australia. We do the DNA testing and provide the results back to the clinician. So that's the causative genes involved in migraine. So, and you'll notice that was very severe types of migraine. But for the more common types of migraine, there's still a very significant genetic component in that, but it's not so clear-cut. It's not one gene in one family. It tends to be susceptibility genes, and maybe there's more than one. So to date, there's been over 50 that have been identified as susceptibility loci or gene regions that play a role in migraine. And so some of these increase your risk. They give you a genetic background, and they're the sorts of people who then tend to develop the more common types of migraine, migraine with aura, migraine without aura. And they're the sorts of types of migraine that can be triggered by environmental changes too, such as different types of food or different smells like strong perfume. Nice foods too, like coffee and red wine and chocolate can trigger migraine in some people. So that's believed to be the genetic background. And those who have that genetic background, then environmental changes can trigger the actual onset of it. And I suppose for that side of it, I don't think we've identified all the genes for migraine yet. We've certainly been working with a large consortium. There's an international headache genetics consortium. And as I've mentioned, we've identified, I think the most recent one had about 48 different gene regions, but these add to other studies as well. And so in total, there's quite a number of genes, but I don't think we've defined all of those, nor how those genes interact if you've got more than one of them as well. So a little bit more work's needed there in order to help with the diagnostics and probably to help with the treatments as well.
Wow. So with the ones that make you susceptible and the ones that cause migraines, is it common for people to have both, or is it very clear cut you'll have one from one group? Or
that's a really good question. So those who've got the causative ones also do tend to get other sorts of migraine too, and it tends to run through their family as well. So yes, you can get both types. And also you obviously would then have both sorts of genes that are playing a role in that too.
oh, that's amazing. So at this stage in your research, how can people apply your research to their daily lives and maybe make their migraines a bit more bearable?
Well, I think the most important thing is to determine what sort of migraine you have. And I mentioned if you've got one of those really severe ones, it is important to work out whether it is migraine or something else. There are some other disorders. One is a disorder called CADASIL, which is the most common hereditary stroke disorder. And one of the most common symptoms for that one is migraine. So it's just important to define, am I looking at this or am I looking at that? So if you've got one of those really severe types of migraine, it's important to work out which sort. And so I think applying the work we've been doing is doing diagnostic testing is something that anyone can do if they have those very severe types of migraine. And that helps then determine what's the best treatment. I think the other sort of studies are still a little bit too early to help with the diagnostics, but they are giving us clues about what would be good treatments to develop. And a lot of the new treatments for migraine, some of them would be the triptans and more recently the CGRP monoclonal antibody treatments are really effective. And they're effective because there's been studies that have shown that these pathways are abnormal in people who suffer from migraine. So doing research to identify what genes and what pathways play a role give us the clues to develop new treatments. And we've got some very good treatments at the moment, but I still don't think we've got enough treatments to cover all the different types of migraine sufferers. And you'll quite often see that there are some migraine sufferers who are very happy with the current new treatment or even old treatment that they're on, but there's a lot who aren't. And I think this is because we haven't identified all the genes that play a role yet, and we haven't identified all the different types of treatments. Because we know there's multiple genes, it's not going to be the same treatment for everyone. It's going to be different and will probably need to be more personalised. So I think the future will be this information feeding into new and better types of treatment and more targeted treatment for migraineurs. So at the moment, I think it's, if I was a migrainer, which I am,
Yeah.
if I'd be looking at, well, what's the best treatment for me? And not always assuming that just being given one, it doesn't work, I won't take anything else, I'll just take painkillers or something, is probably not a good approach. I'd really be looking at the different types of treatment, making sure that you work with your doctor to work out what's the best one and what's the best level for you as well. I'd also be looking at things like some of the triggers, trying to identify what's your particular trigger. And it could be hormonal fluctuations, it could be nice food like chocolate, etc. It's important, I think, to keep a headache diary, see are there any, common things that actually bring your migraine on, because that can be really important for how you manage your migraine and how you manage your treatment.
And with the genetics of migraine, are there any migraines that aren't related to your genes at this stage, or does it look like all of them are influenced?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a little bit hard to answer that one. The current thinking is that there's a genetic background in people who suffer from migraine, but speaking truthfully, probably most of the studies show that probably about, in the common types of migraine, about 60% of the pattern of migraine relates to inheritance or to genetics, and probably the other 40% are interactions with the environment, and that's where the triggers come into it as well. So it's strongly genetic, but it also has environmental factors, and that's why I think it's important to look at your lifestyle, your diet. What are you doing that actually can bring on migraine attacks, and what might you want to modify in your lifestyle? Because it is a complex disorder, multiple genes, multiple environmental factors, and you need to look at how you can balance those in an individual. It's not all genetic and it's not all environment. It's that interplay that's important.
What do you see as the future as your research?
I think the future really is identifying genes to develop newer treatments and more targeted treatments to people. So it's really hand in hand going together with the diagnostics. I think nowadays DNA testing is so much easier and so much cheaper than it used to be. So I think as we know more about the genes, we'll be able to do these tests, make those available to patients and to the doctors, and then target the treatment for that particular person. So use that personalised approach to deciding what's the right treatment for each individual.
And if someone's interested in having their genes tested, should they talk to their GP or their neurologist?
So if you have a common type of migraine, and I don't mean common being a boring type of migraine, I mean it's the more common type where you don't have paralysis, etc. If you have a more common type of migraine, I don't think we're ready for diagnostic testing yet, because as I said, we haven't identified all those genes yet. So it's not going to provide a lot of information. It might say you're susceptible, but you probably know that anyway because you're suffering from migraine. Okay. But I think if you have some of the really severe types of migraine, where there are some, potential loss of consciousness or coma or quite serious sensory defects, particularly numbness and weakness and paralysis, I think those ones are the ones you really should be talking to either your GP, who'll probably refer you to a neurologist. And then tests are just available. They can easily be done by the neurologist ordering it through us, or the pathology companies ordering it through us as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Probably the most important thing is that migraine is an incredibly common disorder. It's it's hard to argue this one, but it's at least one of the top sort of 10 most common disorders in the world. It's really one of the most common neurological disorders as well. And yet a lot of people don't take migraine seriously. They seem to think people say they've got a migraine as just a way of getting off a Monday or something. Well, it's not. I suffered from migraine, and very badly, in my 20s and 30s, and my young son started at about the age of 5. If you know what it's like, and if it runs in your family, you'll know that migraine's a very serious disorder, and I really think we need to be doing more with it. So I think more research is needed to develop better treatments, better diagnostics, and to give people hope, for it is something that occurs for a large amount of your life, affects a very significant number of Australians. So I really think this is something we should be looking at. So if people do want to help with migraine research, I think they should be thinking about this. We can't do research without the public helping us. We can't find genes without DNA samples, as an example, or families that help us. And I also think that people ought to realise that migraine is a serious disorder. So I'd like to see more people take it a little bit more seriously. I don't mean people who've got migraine. I think the rest of the world.
And if people want to get involved with your research or volunteer in some way, who should they contact?
I think the easiest step is to contact myself. So I'll just give you the details. It's Lyn, Lyn .Griffiths, with an S at the end, at qut.edu.au.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll make sure we put that in the bio so everyone can see that.
Thank you very much. We quite often are calling for members of the public to help us with our research in terms of genetics, but also we do clinical trials sometimes as well. So we'd love to have people come forward and help. So thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.